In this video, Alireza Firouzja shocks Magnus Carlsen with the ALEKHINE'S opening at the 2024 Speed Chess Championships. Alright, in the game, Magnus opens 1e4 and Alireza Firouzja responds knight to f6, the ALEKHINE'S opening. Now Magnus goes e5, knocking back the knight, knight to d5, then c4, knight b6, and d4 on the board. This is all very, very standard stuff. Here, Alireza Firouzja finally fights back in the center with the move d6, threatening the future d takes e5. Now Magnus has a choice. Knight to f3 is the old main line, but instead he goes for the other idea, f4, the 4 pawns attack, named after these 4 pawns in the center here. This move is very, very aggressive. Now black goes bishop f5, a very typical idea in the ALEKHINE'S opening 4 pawns attack. Now knight c3, e6, and knight to f3 on the board. Now here, if Alireza Firouzja wanted to go for the main line against the 4 pawns attack of the ALEKHINE'S opening, he would go d takes e5, Magnus would respond f takes e5, and from there it would be a very typical game. But instead here, he goes knight to c6. What is Alireza Firouzja's idea in this ALEKHINE'S opening? Well, let's find out. Here, the best move for Magnus is going to be e takes d6. However, Magnus does not play that. He sticks with the main line, bishop to e3, allowing d takes e5, then f takes e5, again transposing back to the main line here. Instead, Alireza Firouzja, he breaks in the center with the move d5. This is his big idea for this game. Alright, now Magnus, he's ready for a fight. He goes c5, expanding on the queen side and knocking back that knight from the b6 square. Now the knight jumps into c4. Of course, there were other ideas. For example, knight to c8 and knight d7 were also very playable. But I like knight c4. It's a very active, aggressive move, just like Alireza Firouzja. Now here, Magnus, what's he going to do? The knight is threatening the bishop on e3. You can't allow that to happen. So you either got to take the knight on c4, or you have to retreat the bishop or defend it with something else. Now here, the best move is simply bishop takes c4, trading off the bishop for the knight. But instead, Magnus maintains the tension with the move bishop to f2. And this turns out to be a very big mistake, as the knight is threatening the pawn on the b2 square. And here, Alireza Firouzja just takes the pawn on b2. Alright, Magnus, he's down a pawn. What's he going to do? He goes queen b3, threatening the knight and threatening the undefended pawn on the b7 square. That is Magnus Carlsen's idea. However, here, Alireza Firouzja, he missed a very key idea. He could go knight to d3, hitting the king with check and that bishop on f2. Now, no matter what white does, he's going to lose either this bishop on f2 or the one on f1. That would be a fantastic trade for Alireza Firouzja. But instead, he goes knight to c4 in this position, and that turns out to be a very big mistake. Here, Magnus takes on c4 with the bishop, black takes back with the d-pawn, and then Magnus jumps in with the queen to the b7 square. Queen takes b7 on the board. Very good move, threatening the knight on c6. Now, Alireza Firouzja has to defend the knight. Where's he going to go? He goes knight to a5, attacking the queen with the knight and bringing it to a different square. Now here, Magnus, he has a bunch of different squares he could move the queen to. Queen to a6 is the best move, but instead he goes queen to b5, and queen b4 also another possibility. Now from here, Alireza Firouzja, he has to defend the knight on the a5 square. That knight is being attacked by the queen. He goes c6, both defending the knight on a5 and attacking the queen with the c-pawn. Now Magnus, queen to a4, retreats the queen and maintains tension on the knight and the pawn on c4 and the pawn on c6. So, pretty good square for the queen. Now Alireza Firouzja, a very interesting idea. Bishop d3, blocking short castles for Magnus Carlsen. If Magnus just castles and then launches an attack, he's going to have a great game, but now that's not a possibility as the bishop controls the f1 square. Alright, Magnus, he goes bishop h4, hitting the queen with tempo. Of course, the bishop being defended by the knight on f3. Now the queen has to move. Queen c7 on the board. And here Magnus, he plays his absolute favorite move in the game of chess, king to f2, the bomb cloud style move. Magnus is artificially castling here. His idea, perhaps rook e1 or rook d1, and then king g1, reaching a normal castling type position with the king. Alright, now Alireza Firouzja, rook to b8 on the board. Now Magnus, rook h d1, potentially threatening rook takes d3, giving up the rook for the bishop. The idea being, if you do that, you also win the pawn on c4 that goes to d3. Eventually you win the pawn, and Magnus may have a good game after that. Now here, Alireza Firouzja, h6 on the board, trying to control the g5 square. Honestly, not a very good move. Instead, the immediate bishop to e7 may have been better. But instead, h6 on the board, Magnus goes king to g1. He passes up the opportunity to go rook takes d3, so Magnus tried to maintain the tension here. And now Alireza Firouzja, bishop e7. Now bishop takes and king takes on the board. A very interesting idea by Alireza Firouzja. Alireza also playing a bomb cloud style move in this game. And if you know the bomb cloud opening, you know exactly what I'm talking about. All right, now Magnus, What should he be doing in this position? Well, he has a few different ideas. The computer loves the idea of queen to a3. That move is a little complicated. Also, rook takes d3 is a possibility here. Instead, he goes for a more passive idea, knight to e1. His idea being obviously putting pressure on that bishop on d3. However, this move is a little bit slow, and it does give Alireza Firouzja the opportunity to retreat the bishop to a better square. Now here, g6 and h7 are going to be the best retreat squares for the bishop. Instead, Alireza Firouzja going bishop f5. And the problem with this square is the bishop is a little bit more exposed here to future ideas by white. For example, g4 could be a possibility later. And from here, Magnus reroutes the knight on the e1 square. He goes knight c2, routing it to a better square, and perhaps he wants to follow up with moves like knight to e3 or knight b4 or knight to a3 in the future. Again, that bishop on f5 being vulnerable to future knight to e3 ideas. Now Alireza Firouzja, rook d8, finally activating his last piece, and Magnus does the same with the move rook a to b1. However, this turns out to be a very critical mistake. In this position right here, Magnus has to find the key move, knight to b4. Now, this move is incredibly hard to find in a blitz game, the idea being you want to close off the b file, which makes his game that much easier. Instead, rook a to b1 on the board, trying to fight for the b file with the rook. But here, Alireza Firouzja, he spots the flaw behind this move. Here, he just takes on b1, rook takes b1. Now, Magnus has to go knight takes b1, believe it or not. Instead, he takes back with the rook takes b1. This looks logical, but there is an absolutely insane idea here. Again, hard to find in a blitz match, but the key move, if you want to investigate it on your own, is knight to b3. The idea being you block off the queen's defense of the knight on c2. You're threatening bishop takes c2, winning that knight. And for example, if Magnus takes with the rook, you go bishop takes c2, skewering the rook with the queen. You win the knight and the rook. And instead, if white goes a takes b3, then again, bishop takes c2, hits the rook and the pawn. You follow up with bishop takes b3, and you're going to have a great game. But instead, Alireza Firouzja didn't find that. Instead, the move bishop takes c2 on the board for Alireza Firouzja. Now queen takes, and then rook takes d4. And here the game has transformed. Alireza Firouzja is up one pawn. He has those doubled isolated pawns on the c-file, the 2 versus the 1 of Magnus Carlsen. But beyond that, the game is roughly level. Both sides have the knight, the rook, and the queen, and they have roughly equal activity in this position. Now Magnus, queen to h7, threatening the pawn on g7. Very interesting idea. And now Alireza Firouzja, he should be taking the pawn on the f4 square, winning that pawn, threatening queen takes e5, and defending f7 in certain lines. Instead, he goes knight b7, a very slow move, and now Magnus, queen takes g7 on the board. And real fast, if you'd like analyzing games on your own, I recommend looking into the move knight to e4 with the idea of f5, f6. That's all I'm going to say about that move. Instead, queen takes g7 on the board. Now knight to d8 for Alireza Firouzja, continuing his idea of rerouting the knight to a better defensive square. Now Magnus, he takes on h6, queen takes h6, winning the pawn, and also defending the pawn on the f4 square. So good multi-purpose defensive and offensive move. Now Alireza Firouzja, queen to a5, hitting the pawn on a2 and the knight on the c3 square. Now queen to h4 hits the king, king d7. This turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. Instead, king to f8 surprisingly was the better square for the king. Now queen to e1, excellent move, defending the knight on c3. Now Alireza Firouzja, rook d3, again threatening the knight once again, but then Magnus, knight to e4, moving the knight to a better square. Now it has access to both d6 and f6, and it defends the pawn on the c5 square. All right, Alireza Firouzja, he spots now that knight to e4 is on the board. The knight no longer defends a2, and he just gobbles up that pawn. Queen takes a2. Now rook to a1 hits the queen. Queen c2 on the board. Now Magnus has some tension on that pawn on a7. He could win it with check, but instead, rook to c1 on the board. What's the idea? Well, the queen goes to b2, and then Magnus wins the pawn on c4. So Magnus thinking that pawn on c4 is more important than the one on the a7 square. Now here, Alireza Firouzja makes a very, very, very fatal mistake. Knight to b7. Now, this is a good time for a puzzle. This position happened in the game, and Magnus did not find the winning move. And yes, there is a move that wins on the spot. Even if you're 200 ELO, you can find this move right here. All right, I hope you found the winning idea for Magnus Carlsen here. Magnus didn't find it in the game. The key move, obviously, is going to be rook to b4, forking the knight and the queen, and there's nothing Alireza Firouzja can do to hold on to the knight. But instead, Magnus here, he misses the idea of rook to b4. Instead, he plays h3, just kind of a waiting move, getting rid of back rank mating threat ideas. He now has the h2 square available for the king. But now, Alireza Firouzja, a5, gaining space on the queen side and stopping rook to b4 ideas. So Alireza Firouzja must have seen this idea, and Magnus Carlsen must be kicking himself right now for not seeing rook to b4. All right, Magnus, king to h2, continuing his idea with h3, a move prior. Now, rook d4, offering the trade of rooks. Magnus obliges, rook takes d4, then queen takes, and now h4. Magnus Carlsen trying to push his passed pawn down the board as fast as he can. His idea, of course, is going to be h5, h6, h7, then h8. However, Alireza Firouzja, he has the exact same idea. a4 on the board, now h5, now a3. Both sides pushing their pawns as fast as humanly possible. What's going to happen from here? Well, Magnus Carlsen, he makes a big mistake. He goes queen d2, offering the queen trade. Instead, he didn't have to do that. He can actually just go h6 here, and he has a clear advantage in this position. Real fast, I want to show you. If Magnus goes h6, then both sides push their pawns, a2, h7, a1, queen. Then Magnus takes and promotes his pawn to a queen. And here in this endgame, he has a safer king and an extra pawn on the g-file, and is just much better overall. Instead, Magnus didn't play this. In this position, he went queen to d2 instead of h6. Now, Alireza Firouzja does not miss his chance. He trades the queens on d2, queen takes d2, knight takes, and then knight takes c5, winning the pawn on the c5 square. Of course, that last move wasn't completely necessary. Instead, a2 may have been even stronger. And here, Alireza Firouzja can even later go king to e7, and his king will be in the square of the pawn, meaning his king will be in time to stop that pawn from promoting. But instead, knight takes c5 on the board, h6 for Magnus, a2, h7, both sides going all out in this pawn race. Now we have a1 queen, h8 queen. Both sides once again have queens, and now we have a queen and knight endgame instead of just a basic knight and pawn endgame. All right, Alireza Firouzja, queen d4, hitting the knight on the d2 square. Now queen to f6, threatening the pawn on f7. Alireza Firouzja takes on d2. Magnus is now down a knight, but he has an idea to win back the knight. First, queen takes f7. The king goes to c8. Then, bada boom, queen to f8, hitting both the king on c8 and the knight on the c5 square. Now king d7, queen takes knight. Now it's an all-out dogfight in this queen and pawn endgame. Magnus, of course, being up a pawn, he has the advantage, but perhaps Alireza Firouzja can hold a draw here. All right, queen takes f4. Now we have even material. The king's got to go somewhere. King to h3. Then queen f5 hits the king. g4 hits the queen. Queen d3 hits the king. King h4, queen d5, offering the queen trade. This would be very interesting if Magnus took here, but he does not. He goes queen to a7. Now the king moves. Now queen b8 check. King f7. Now king to h5. This is a curious move. Perhaps Magnus Carlsen is trying to pin down the black king and use his king as an offensive weapon, but it's not enough. Here, queen to h1 hits the king. King g5, queen c1 hits the king again. The king goes to h5. And here in this position, both sides repeat moves 3 times in a row, and we have a draw by repetition in this unbelievable game from the 2024 Speed Chess Championships Finals between Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firouzja. Wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, if you enjoyed this video, go and smash that like button. Seriously, smash that like button. It's the #1 thing you can do to help out my channel. And while you're at it, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist and comment down below what you thought of this game. And I'll see you in the next video.